This is Crosscut Reports. I'm Maleeha Syed. Today, we're looking at how people in Washington are feeling about next year's presidential election.
Some voters would prefer to have Democratic and Republican nominees who are not named Joe Biden or Donald Trump.
A recent Crosscut Elway poll of around 400 registered voters in Washington found that many respondents are dissatisfied with America's political system. They also have a pessimistic view of major issues the country is facing, such as gun violence and immigration. In this episode, Crosscut state politics reporter Joseph O'Sullivan breaks down some key takeaways from the poll, including people's attitudes about the upcoming election, their thoughts on the leading candidates, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and the factors that are going to influence who they choose for president. So I think the first kind of overarching question is just, what is this poll? Could you explain it a little bit and what the broad theme is?
Well, this year, 2023, in fact, this week, we finished up our local elections in Seattle, Spokane, Tacoma, Bellingham, and places all around the state. And so, it's time to start looking forward, whether people like it or not, to 2024. We've got a big presidential election. Of course, we have a lot of big state elections in Washington state next year, too, Washington Attorney General's office, et cetera. But we wanted to take a look at, how people are feeling right about now as we go into next year's general election. And we already have a pretty good idea about who the Democratic and the Republican nominees are going to be. Incumbent Democratic President Joe Biden and the former President of the United States, Donald Trump.
What were some of the takeaways that you saw just looking at the poll and seeing how people responded? How are people feeling going into 2024 and going into this upcoming election?
I wouldn't say the mood is great among the people polled. I mean, people across the political spectrum. And this is a Crosscut Stuart Elway poll. And so one of the questions that we asked was, are you feeling generally optimistic or pessimistic, about the following things? On climate change, 27% of those polled were optimistic and 43% were pessimistic. The national economy, 31% said they were optimistic, while 54% said they were pessimistic. Inequality in America, 24% optimistic, 49% pessimistic, and so on and so forth. Immigration, race relations in the U.S., gun violence in the U.S. So I think wherever you look in the electorate, I mean, people are sort of coming with questions with, we have some problems, and how are we going to fix them?
Yeah, and in this first question in the poll, it just asks people to grade America's political system and where they're at, and the average was a D for unsatisfactory.
Well, we're getting a D right now, yeah.
Was that surprising?
No, I don't think so. The nation's been increasingly polarized over the years. Political and cultural divisions have deepened, and of course we saw that very much on display in the last several years. The 2016 presidential election was very contentious.
He's been my candidate from day one because he's not a politician.
I'm sickened. I'm without words. I thought for sure that Hillary would win this election.
After the 2020 election, the former president, pushed to overturn the results.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing.
And everybody's sort of fired up, right? No matter what side of that thing you're on, you're concerned and worried and possibly angry.
That's what was interesting is you look at these two leading candidates who you mentioned, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who have both served as president. And there were criticisms of both of them. And some of them were similar. Some of them were really unique to each president. Could you talk about sort of what those distinctions were?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think every presidential election, the dynamic is a little different. And the dynamic that we have going on, assuming, these are the two nominees, but I think that's it. If we looked at it today, that's a pretty safe assumption. These two players have been around a long time. People are not thrillingly in love with them for different reasons. A lot of people are concerned about Joe Biden's age, and that's from our poll. One of the interesting things is that President Biden's 80 years old, but Trump is only 77.
Right.
So and if you go out and talk to people, there are people that just well, okay, it's, two more old guys on the ballot and I'm going to have to, choose between one or the other. Although most people have their mind made up already, which is another finding in this poll. So for Biden, it's, can he still do the job? People for Trump, mentioned corrupt. That was, 45% of those polled said Trump is corrupt. In comparison, 29% of those polled called Biden corrupt. 18% said both were corrupt.
And then some say neither's a strong leader. So it seems to set the tone how people are feeling about these presidential candidates going in, kind of this pessimism that you were talking about at the top of the conversation.
Yeah. And, if you're the type of voter that sort of drags yourself to the presidential polls every 4 years and the choice is, chicken or fish or something, and you sort of have to choose. And that is a thing about our country. We're like 330 million people. We could probably be 10 different countries, culturally, regionally, politically around the nation. But it all boils down at the end of the way to a Democrat and a Republican, more or less. Now, we did have some interesting polling on independent candidates in this as well.
Yeah, I was interested because it seemed like when the poll asked about independent candidates, namely, I think it was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Cornel West, and when they were thrown into the mix, that seemed to shake up the numbers a little bit.
It was an interesting question to ask. So, first we asked about Trump and Biden, and then we asked, well, if there are a couple of independent candidates running who may take the ballot in the state, who would you be inclined to vote for? And so in Washington state, Joe Biden got 37%, Donald Trump got 25%, Robert Kennedy Jr. got 9%, and independent Cornel West got 3%. So some of the stuff in here is interesting. The current president, Biden, is not doing great in the poll right now in Washington state. Now, does that mean he's going to lose Washington state in November next year? Probably not. I mean, we vote pretty standard for Democrats in this state. But the interesting thing on the side about Trump is that Robert Kennedy Jr. is pulling more from Republicans than Democrats. It's a little ironic because a lot of Republican TV commentators and stuff were sort of pushing Robert Kennedy earlier when he was running as a Democrat.
Democratic presidential candidate RFK Jr. testified about government censorship, and surprise, surprise, the Democrats on the committee tried to censor him.
But now he's running as an independent, and it looks like he might hurt conservatives more. And then, you have the independent Cornel West, the public intellectual and author and speaker and thinker.
And just this week, a third-party candidate jumped into the race, Dr. Cornel West, who launched his bid as a member of the People's Party. And
it's funny. I know there's a neighborhood in East Olympia, and if you want to get a sense of how divided we are, and Olympia is a pretty progressive town, but there's one house with a Trump flag, and then the next house has a Cornel West for president sign. So you really get, you get a full spectrum.
Yeah. And kind of going back to some of those issues that you were talking about, the poll itself asks people across the board, how they're feeling about inequality, race relations, immigration, climate change. I mean, really broad issues that the country's facing and grappling with. And every single measure, they polled quite pessimistically.
Yeah. I don't know, and somebody smarter than me can speak to this, but I don't know that they're ever everybody's ever super optimistic about everything.
Right.
But the poll, and I think we have a couple other questions we'll get to in a second here, really sort of underscores the people really aren't feeling great right now about our politics and what's getting done or not getting done, and the magnitude of the problems confronting us, depending on what sort of what's on your mind.
Yeah, and thinking about some of the issues that people are grappling with when they're going into this election, how are they feeling really broadly when they were asked to talk about the upcoming election? And what are some of their feelings when they were asked to boil it down to one or two words?
So this was certainly an interesting one. We basically asked an open-ended question. How would you describe your feelings about the upcoming election in one or two words? 19%, so 1 in 5 of those polled basically said worried or scared, anxious, uneasy, concerned. 16% said positive, or some variety of that. 13% said discouraged. 9%, so 1 out of every 10 voter polled roughly said horror show / mess. And pollster Stuart Elway toned that one down a little. The word he was actually hearing more than once was shit show, apparently.
It was a nice euphemism.
It was a nice euphemism, yeah. And then, 8%, a threat to democracy. I mean, people are really tuned in. We just went through January 6th. In Washington, Oregon, the Northwest, of course, we see a lot of politics play out in street battles on the streets of Portland and Olympia, a little bit on Seattle, too.
We are tracking breaking news coming out of Olympia tonight. Police there have declared a riot as opposing groups held simultaneous protests.
So these clashes are around, and people are seeing them. in a way that, probably haven't seen in a few generations. I mean, the 1960s, of course, was sort of turbulent in that sense. But
Right.
but people are broadly aware. And the interesting thing about that is it's sort of across the political spectrum. So if you're a Democrat or a progressive, you watched January 6th, and you saw this effort to overturn the presidential election results. If you're a conservative, you have some skepticism of the voting system. Now, Washington's system is pretty safe and secure, especially compared to most states, with paper balloting and everything that we do. But of course, if you've lived long enough and you're a Republican in this state, you remember the Dino Rossi-Chris Gregoire election.
Both Republican Dino Rossi and Democrat Christine Gregoire did at different times claim title as governor-elect.
Dino won on the first count, and then I think on the second count, and then it went, in the courts, Governor Gregoire prevailed. And that was before our current voting system. The voting system was pretty different back then. It was a mix of in-person and mail-in ballots. And they've made a lot of changes since. But if you remember that, right, that's probably sticking in your mind. And for conservatives, too, if you're skeptical of government, you just went through a couple of years of some of the strictest pandemic restrictions.
Right.
Stuff that, nobody ever really saw in their lifetimes.
And I think that kind of leads us to this other bigger question. When people are thinking about who they're going to choose for president, what are some of the big issues and factors that they're going to take into account when they decide to opt for their candidate?
Yeah, so, on the one hand, there's probably not a lot of voters that are undecided, right? We did this election 4 years ago. I can't imagine a lot of Trump voters are magically Biden voters now, and I can't imagine a lot of Biden voters are magically Trump voters. But people are still paying attention to issues, of course. The single biggest issue that we got in our poll was on the economy. That was about 28%. You had the border and immigration at 10%, and democracy issues, protecting democracy, bringing the country together, election integrity. That was about 9%. And then 9% of people just said flat out Biden v. Trump. That's going to be their decision. Crime was 6%. Climate change was 4%. Abortion was 3%. On the one hand, abortion was 3%. On the other hand, we've seen Democrats get a resurgence at the ballot box ever since Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Democrats had several big victories. One of them, obviously, here in the state of Ohio, when it comes to women's reproductive rights.
And then foreign affairs has made an appearance, which Stuart Elway said doesn't happen all the time. About 8% of people are thinking about that. Of course, right now, we've been supporting Ukraine in the face of the invasion by Russia there. And then, of course, now we have the attack by Hamas on Israeli citizens, and the Israeli military and forces are now in an incursion and bombarding the Gaza Strip, and the United States is supplying arms and weapons there. And so people are thinking about these, they're keeping this stuff in their mind. And, who knows? Foreign affairs doesn't always play into the exact final decision on things, but there are years where it comes to a higher priority for voters.
And one thing that you had mentioned is a handful of people are saying they're just opting for a candidate who could beat the other candidate. One thing that Stuart Elway, I have in my notes, said something along the lines of, no majority thinks any positive description fits either, but there are a majority of people who think each negative fits one or the other, and kind of reinforces this picture of dread of choice or this negative campaign ahead. That seems to be kind of a theme going into 2024 for Washingtonians. Yeah, I think so. And again, I think part of it's just because, people know these two candidates, these two presidents, really, for so long now. It's when somebody's brand new, right? You don't know them. You don't know their backstory. You haven't been sitting around watching TV whenever they did something that you thought was good or bad, But that's not the case with these two. People have been reading about Trump and Biden forever, and they're sort of, their eyes are opened in that sense. They're not thrilled, but that's kind of the system as it is right now. Yeah, it almost feels like it's kind of cliche, but the lesser of two evils vote. Yeah, and that's, that ends up being, again, in a country of 330 million where the choices end up being chicken and fish. You just, for a lot of people, you go to the ballot box and sort of hold your nose and vote for the one you dislike less. Yeah. people in Washington who responded to this poll were asked about incumbent candidate Maleeha Cantwell, who's a U.S. Senator from Washington. Could you talk about how people responded when they were asked about her running again for election?
Sure. So, we asked, how would you rate the job that Senator Cantwell is doing? 10% said excellent, 25% said good, 25% said fair, 25% said poor, and 15% said no opinion. So, kind of a broad spectrum there. Senator Cantwell's running again. A moderate Republican, Raul Garcia, is running. It may wind up being those two on the ballot. And Senator Cantwell has 43%, Republican, Raul Garcia had 23%. The conventional wisdom is for an incumbent, you don't ever want to be below 50%, right? But Democrats, at the end of the day, generally come out and reelect our two senators. They've been here a while. Maleeha Cantwell beat Republican Slade Gorton in 2000. Slade Gorton was the last Republican elected to the Senate. That was 1994 out of Washington State. So that sort of shows how the tide has shifted in the federal, statewide offices for senator. It's going to be tough to beat a Democratic ticket here, especially with Trump on the ballot.
This poll is maybe unusually, it's pretty early. We still have another year before we even see how things shake out. Do you think there's a lot of potential for change when we're looking at these results, or do you think people are kind of set when it comes to the candidates that they're going to choose next year?
I don't know that there's major surprises in Washington State right now, for president or senator when it comes which way is the state going to go. But politics changes fast. Issues come and go really fast. You have no clue what's going to happen between now and next November. We wanted to do this poll because it's a good snapshot right now to get a sense of where things are. It gives you a good baseline because we're going to, of course, watch how these things evolve over the next 10, 12 months. And if there is a big sentiment change, right, we'll be able to track it and hopefully even help explain it.
Thanks for listening to Crosscut Reports. This episode was reported by Joseph O'Sullivan. It was produced by Sarah Bernard and me, Maleeha Syed. The story editor was Ryan Famuliner. Our executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to Crosscut Reports wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. Also, if you would like to support the work we do at Crosscut, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Seattle's PBS station, KCTS 9. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. That's also where you'll find a text version of the story we discussed today. Crosscut Reports is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Maleeha Syed. We'll be back soon with another episode.